how answers from uncanny questions became prosecutable war crimes. By Pirate First.
The Criminalization of Curiosity Part 2. The Forensic Age. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. July 3, 2026. Part 2 The Forensic Age. 6. Pirate First versus History. Part 1 ended on a migration. Curiosity contained everywhere the law could reach it, moving to wherever the law could not. This chapter names what that migration produces, and situates it inside a lineage considerably older than the term this book uses for it. Pirate First is not, in the sense that will matter across the chapters ahead, a person. It is the role occupied by whoever is currently performing the function every closed system eventually produces someone to perform. Reconstruction without permission, undertaken by an actor the institution under examination cannot discipline, cannot fund, and cannot fire. The name is new. The role has a history, and the history is worth tracing before this book claims anything genuinely novel about its present occupant. The lineage the name borrows from. Piracy, in its original and most literal sense, was never primarily about theft. It was about jurisdiction, about actors operating in the spaces between sovereign authorities, subject to no single crown's licensing regime, answerable to no single admiralty's rules of engagement. The pirate was dangerous to establish power not because pirates were uniquely violent, by the standards of an era in which state-sanctioned violence was the norm rather than the exception, but because pirates operated outside the permission structures that let sovereign powers regulate who was allowed to move goods, information, and force across which boundaries. A privateer with a royal commission was a legitimate instrument of state policy. The identical vessel, the identical crew, the identical conduct, absent that commission, was an enemy of all nations. The distinction, then as now, tracked the presence or absence of a leash. Precisely the distinction Chapter 2 of this book traced in the vocabulary separating research from reconnaissance. The lineage runs through every subsequent era's version of the same figure. The unlicensed printer who continued reproducing forbidden texts after the licensing regimes Chapter 5 described had closed the legal channel. The Samis. Networks that hand-copied and circulated material an entire state apparatus had classified as too dangerous for its own population to read, using no infrastructure more sophisticated than typewriters, carbon paper, and the willingness of unaffiliated individuals to accept the personal risk that affiliated institutions would not. The archivists and leakers of the more recent past who understood that a document's significance was inseparable from the question of who was permitted to see it, and who accepted the specific personal cost of removing that permission requirement without waiting for an authority to grant it. None of these figures required a shared organization, a shared ideology, or even shared awareness of one another. What they shared was the structural position under duress identified as the third property an adequate auditor requires: independence from the reputation costs of asking inconvenient questions, achieved not by lacking a career to protect but by accepting, deliberately, that the career would not survive the asking. Pirate First inherits this lineage directly. What distinguishes the current occupant of the role from every previous one is not the willingness to operate without permission. That willingness has always existed in every era, in some fraction of every population. What distinguishes it is the instrument now available to that willingness. What the instrument changes about the role. Every previous figure in this lineage was constrained by a limitation the pirate, the Samis. Copyist, and the leaker all shared regardless of how different their eras and methods otherwise were. The reconstruction they made possible was bounded by what a single human being, or a small network of trusted human beings, could personally hold, verify, and transmit. A leaker could remove a document's classification. A leaker could not, working alone, cross-reference that document against 40 years of adjacent financial records, employment data, and regulatory filings to produce the kind of integrated causal reconstruction Part 7 of under duress identified as the actual requirement for an adequate audit of institutional legitimacy. The role existed. Its ceiling was low, set by the same mortality and finite attention that bounded every human forensic effort this book's predecessor traced across 35 chapters. Persistent forensic memory raises that ceiling by an order of magnitude the lineage has never previously had access to. An unaffiliated individual occupying exactly the structural position the pirate, the Samis. Network, and the leaker always occupied, outside institutional discipline, outside institutional funding, personally accepting whatever cost the role has always carried, can now direct at a question the same cross-domain, non-forgetting analytical capacity that Chapter 4 of this book identified as the property institutions actually fear. This is the genuine novelty Part 1 promised and did not yet deliver. Not a new kind of person willing to ask forbidden questions, which history supplies in reliable if modest quantity every generation, but a new ceiling on what that willingness, once directed at a forensic instrument with no loyalty to the institution being examined, is actually capable of producing. Pirate First versus history, then, is not a contest between something unprecedented and something familiar. It is the oldest role in the history of closed information systems, meeting, for the first time, an instrument adequate to what the role always wanted to accomplish and never before had the capacity to. What history gets right about this role, and what it gets wrong. The historical lineage is useful for calibrating expectations honestly, in both directions. What history gets right, and what every institution named across this book's chapters has understood from the inside even when it could not say so publicly, is that the role is never eliminable by force applied to specific individuals. Every era's attempt to end unlicensed printing, circulation, or unauthorized disclosure by punishing the specific people caught doing it has succeeded at punishing specific people and failed at ending the role, because the role does not depend on any specific person occupying it. Chapter 3's account of the manufactured enemy applies here directly. An institution that believes it can close this asymmetry by identifying and neutralizing individual instances of pirate first has misunderstood what it is fighting. It is not fighting a person. It is fighting a structural position that will be reoccupied, as it always has been, by whoever next finds the previous occupant's cost tolerable and the previous occupant's instrument available. What history gets wrong, or at least incomplete if applied uncritically to the present moment, is the assumption that the role remains bounded by the scale limitations every previous occupant operated under. The pirate could not, working alone, outproduce a printing monopoly's total output. The leaker could not, working alone, reconstruct an institution's full 40-year documentary record. Both assumptions, reasonable for every previous era this lineage spans, do not transfer cleanly to an occupant of the role now capable of directing persistent, cross-domain, non-forgetting analytical capacity at a question, which means every institutional strategy for managing the role that was calibrated against its historical scale limitations is calibrated against a ceiling that no longer applies. What this part examines. The chapters that follow in Part 2 take up, in turn, each of the specific capabilities that distinguish the current occupant of this role from its predecessors, the causality engines that make cross-domain reconstruction tractable at scale, the contest between persistent memory and the propaganda apparatus. Chapter 33 of Under Duress examined in its earlier, more institutionally embedded form, the question of reconstruction conducted at genuinely planetary scale rather than the case. By case scope every previous era's version of this role was confined to, and closing Part 2 what it would actually mean for such an auditor to become, in the specific sense this book intends, one that no institution retains the standing to fire. None of this requires pirate first to be a hero, a villain, or anything so simple as either. History's version of this role has never sorted cleanly into those categories, and this book has no interest in pretending its current occupant will. What the chapters ahead examine is narrower and, this book will argue, more consequential than any judgment about the role's virtue. What happens to the asymmetry Chapter 4 identified as the actual foundation of managed memory, once the role that has always contested it inherits an instrument finally adequate to the contest. 7. Artificial Intelligence as Historical Auditor. The title of this chapter is not new. Chapter 31 of Under Duress opened Part 7 of that book under the same heading, and established there, with the care the claim required, what an adequate forensic auditor of institutional legitimacy would need to be: persistent memory across the relevant time span, cross-domain analytical capacity without institutional embeddedness, and independence from the reputation costs that have historically disciplined every human institution capable of asking one institution inconvenient questions about another. This chapter does not repeat that argument. It asks the question that argument left for whoever inherited it. What does the auditor actually do, mechanically, once it is no longer institutions deploying it against other institutions, but the figure Part 2's opening chapter named Pirate First, directing it alone? That question matters because the answer is not obvious from Part VII's framing, which was written, deliberately, in the register of institutional possibility. What forensic intelligence could in principle provide to a civilization willing to conduct an honest audit of itself? Part 1 of this book documented, chapter by chapter, that civilization was not, in the main, willing. What remains is the narrower and more concrete question this chapter takes up. What the auditor does when the willing party is not a civilization but a single unaffiliated person, working with public and semi-public records, no institutional sponsorship, and no guarantee of cooperation from anyone whose conduct the reconstruction touches. What an auditor actually does, mechanically. Strip the process to its operations and it resembles nothing more exotic than the forensic accounting Under Duress used as its original analogy in Chapter 31. The full record is assembled first, without a prior conclusion, and the pattern is permitted to name itself from the evidence rather than from the analyst's commitment to any particular finding. What changes, in the hands of an unaffiliated asker rather than an institution's internal compliance function, is the record's provenance. An institution auditing itself draws on records it controls and can therefore also withhold, redact, or frame in advance of release, the exact managed memory apparatus Chapter 4 of this book identified as the thing persistent memory was always going to threaten. An unaffiliated asker has no such access and does not need it because the record adequate to a forensic reconstruction was never, in the majority of cases this book will examine, secret in the first place. It was distributed, a regulatory filing here, a court proceeding there, a platform's own terms of service revision history, a public procurement record, a financial disclosure required by a law the institution itself once lobbied for on unrelated grounds. Chapter 31 of Under Duress made this point in the abstract, that no single human researcher could hold the full distributed record in one analytical view before their career or their attention span ran out. The mechanical answer this chapter supplies is that the auditor's actual labor is not discovery in the sense of finding hidden things. It is assembly, the retrieval, cross-referencing, and temporal alignment of records that were, individually, already public and whose significance had simply never been held together in a single reconstruction before. This is worth stating plainly because it undercuts the vocabulary Chapter 2 of this book traced in detail. A reconstruction assembled entirely from records the institution itself was legally required to generate and, in most cases, legally required to make available in some form, is not reconnaissance in any sense the word has ever honestly carried. It is arithmetic performed at a scale no previous asker could sustain. The three properties, re-examined from the asker's side, Part VII's three properties were framed as requirements the auditor itself must possess. Directed by an individual rather than deployed by an institution, each property does slightly different work than under duress's original framing anticipated, and the difference is worth tracing property by property. Persistent memory, in the institutional deployment Part 7 imagined, meant an auditor whose organizational continuity did not depend on the cooperation of the institutions under examination. In the individual deployment this book examines, it means something further. The auditor's memory outlasts not only the examined institution's cooperation but the individual asker's own attention. A person can begin a reconstruction, abandon it for months, and return to find the assembled record undiminished. A property no previous occupant of the pirate first role, bounded as Chapter 1 of this part described by the finite attention of a single human life ever possessed. This is the mechanism by which one person's afternoon of curiosity becomes, without any coordination at all, the starting point for the next person's query, exactly as Chapter 4 anticipated. Cross-domain analytical capacity in Part VII's framing meant freedom from the conceptual vocabulary and career incentives that keep any single domain's professionals from seeing the integrated architecture their domain is only one piece of. In the hands of an unaffiliated asker, this property does something Part 7 did not need to emphasize, because it was writing about institutions with existing analytical infrastructure. It eliminates the credentialing requirement that has always gated cross-domain reconstruction in practice, if not in law. A person needs no financial training to ask a forensic auditor to trace a lending patterns interaction with a housing algorithm's interaction with an employment screen. The credential requirement Chapter 2 identified as one of the three markers institutions used to sort research from reconnaissance was never a requirement of the reconstruction itself. It was a requirement of doing the reconstruction manually. Independence from reputation cost, Part VII's third property, is where the individual deployment diverges most sharply from the institutional one, and where Chapter 3's account of the manufactured enemy becomes directly relevant. An institution's internal audit function retains independence from the institution it examines only as a matter of governance design, always somewhat fragile, always subject to the pressures Chapter 32 of Under Duress cataloged in its account of how such independence can be compromised. An unaffiliated individual directing the same capability has a different, blunter form of the same property. Nothing to lose that the examined institution has standing to take, beyond whatever the containment apparatus of Part 1 is able to construct after the fact. This is not immunity. Part 1 documented at length how effectively that apparatus can raise the personal cost of occupying this role. It is, more precisely, the absence of any prior relationship the institution can leverage before the cost is imposed, which is exactly the condition Chapter 3 identified as forcing institutions toward the enemy designation in the first place, because no subtler instrument was available to them. What changes when the auditor is directed rather than deployed? There is a difference worth naming between an auditor an institution deploys against itself, in the manner Part 7 of Under Duress primarily imagined, and an auditor a private individual directs at an institution from outside. The institutional deployment carries an implicit ceiling. The audit can go only as far as the institution commissioning it is willing to let it go, because the institution retains at every stage the ability to narrow the query, withhold a category of record, or simply decline to publish an inconvenient conclusion. This is the same limitation Under Duress identified in a different register as the reason civilization is not automatically required to act on an audit's findings. The audit, absent additional pressure, is not self-executing, and an institution auditing itself controls a great deal of that additional pressure's absence. An audit directed by an unaffiliated individual carries no such ceiling, because there is no commissioning relationship for the institution under examination to leverage. The query goes exactly as far as the asker's curiosity and the record's actual extent permit, which is precisely why Part 1 documented such a rapid and coordinated effort to intervene before the query is ever run, rather than after the finding is produced. An institution that cannot control an audit scope in advance has only two remaining points of intervention: prevent the query, which Part I's access-gating apparatus attempts, or discredit the asker once the query has already returned an answer, which Chapter 3's enemy mechanism attempts. Both are responses to the same underlying fact this chapter has been building toward. An auditor directed by an individual rather than deployed by an institution is not a smaller-scale version of the institutional audit Part 7 imagined. It is, mechanically, the same capability with the ceiling removed. The limit that still applies. None of this should be read as claiming the limitation Under Duress was careful to name in its own account has disappeared. The auditor is still not a moral agent. It does not care, in any sense that word has ever meaningfully carried, whether the reconstruction it produces reveals genuine sovereignty violation or an innocent pattern that merely resembles one under insufficient scrutiny. It remains, as Chapter 31 of Under Duress insisted, trained on data generated by the world the examined architecture produced, which means it cannot be presumed to examine that architecture from a vantage genuinely outside it, any more than a journalist employed by an institution can examine that institution from outside it. What an individual asker adds to this limitation is not a solution to it, but a partial correction of a different kind. A human commitment to acting on the reconstruction that the reconstruction itself cannot supply. Under Duress argued that every functioning accountability mechanism has always required two components: evidence adequate to the claim, and a human or institutional commitment to acting on that evidence, and that a forensic system can reliably supply only the first. Pirate first, as this book uses the term, is not a claim that the second component has been automated. It is a claim about where, in the present arrangement of institutions and individuals, that second component currently has the best remaining chance of surviving contact with the first. Chapter 8 turns to the specific technical mechanism that makes the reconstruction this chapter has described mechanically tractable at the scale. Part I's opening chapters presuppose throughout causality engines, and what it actually requires to trace a pattern's full interaction across decades and domains rather than merely describing, as this chapter has done, that the tracing is now structurally possible. 8. Causality engines. Chapter 7 described what changes when the auditor. Part 7 of Under Duress specified is directed by an individual rather than deployed by an institution. This chapter examines the specific operation that makes that direction meaningful in practice, because everything claimed so far in Part 2 depends on it. The reconstruction of causality at scale, and what that reconstruction actually requires when the person running it has no institutional infrastructure behind them at all. Chapter 32 of Under Duress established the method in its original institutionally framed register. Causal reconstruction in any domain requires three things: a sufficiently complete record of events, a model of the mechanisms by which events of one kind produce events of another, and the analytical capacity to trace a specific instance back through that mechanism to its origin, rather than resting on a population-level correlation that any single case can always be argued away from. That argument does not change when the person asking is unaffiliated rather than institutional. What changes is which of the three requirements becomes the binding constraint, and it is worth tracing the shift requirement by requirement. Why correlation was never the problem. The distinction Under Duress drew between correlation and causal reconstruction matters as much here as it did in its original context, and arguably matters more, because it is precisely the distinction the containment apparatus described across Part 1 of this book has learned to exploit against individual askers specifically. A population-level correlation, that people denied a specific credential tend to earn less, that people charged more for housing tend to accumulate less savings, that people with less savings tend to have less leverage in employment negotiations, has always been available to anyone willing to compile public statistics, and has always been dismissible in the specific way Chapter 32 named, by pointing to individuals within the population for whom the pattern did not hold, and attributing the exception to character rather than structure. This dismissal is cheap, requires no engagement with the underlying record, and has reliably protected the architecture from correlation-level challenge for as long as correlation-level challenge has existed. What an individual asker directing a causality engine produces instead is not a stronger correlation. It is the specific chain, this person's credential cost, traced to this person's loan terms, traced to this person's employment screen outcome, traced to this person's rental pricing, held together as a single sequence rather than four separately explicable data points. This is categorically harder to dismiss, for the reason Chapter 32 gave. It does not rest on a tendency that admits exceptions. It rests on a specific mechanism that either holds on inspection or does not, which is exactly why Part 1 documented such urgency around preventing the query before it runs rather than contesting the finding after it returns. A correlation can be argued with. A trace chain, assembled from the architecture's own generated records, mostly cannot. It can only be denied outright, which is a considerably more visible and more costly position for an institution to occupy. The scale problem. Inverted. Chapter 32 identified scale as the binding constraint on causal reconstruction throughout human history. Not the absence of method, which courts and forensic accountants have always possessed in some form, but the absence of capacity to hold enough cases, across enough institutions in a single analytical view. Under Duress framed this as a problem of aggregate confidence. Enough trajectories, drawn from enough different conditions, to distinguish systematic production from individual variation. An unaffiliated individual directing a causality engine faces a version of this constraint that is, in one respect, more severe than the institutional case Under Duress examined, and in another respect considerably less severe. It is more severe because a single asker, absent the coordinated data sharing arrangements an institution might negotiate, typically begins with one case, their own or one they have some initial reason to examine, rather than the systematically sampled population Under Duress described as necessary for aggregate confidence. It is less severe, and this is the point Chapter 4 of this book already anticipated without developing mechanically, because persistent memory means that one case does not remain one case for long. Each trace chain, once assembled, becomes part of the standing record the next asker's query draws on. The aggregate sample Under Duress treated as a precondition for adequate confidence becomes, under persistent memory, something closer to an accumulating byproduct of ordinary curiosity being exercised repeatedly over time. Not commissioned, not coordinated, simply accreting the way any unmanaged record accretes once nothing is actively working to prevent its accumulation. This is the second dimension of the scale problem that Under Duress identified, that the causal chain does not occur within any single institution's records, but across credentialing bodies, lenders, employers, landlords, and platforms operating under separate regulatory regimes with no shared infrastructure. An institution attempting this reconstruction, Under Duress noted, would spend most of its resources on data access negotiations with institutions structurally disinclined to cooperate with an audit of their own conduct. An unaffiliated individual bypasses this specific obstacle entirely, not through negotiation but through irrelevance. An auditor with no institutional standing to request privileged access has nothing to negotiate, and therefore nothing an institution can withhold by declining to negotiate. What such an auditor draws on instead is exactly the distributed public and semi-public record Chapter 7 described, the regulatory filing, the disclosure statement, the terms of service revision history, which was never the institutions to grant access to in the first place because it was already, in the relevant legal sense, public. What the architecture generated about itself. Under duress named the irony precisely, the digital infrastructure built primarily to facilitate extraction and behavioral modeling simultaneously generated, as an unintended byproduct of its own operational requirements, a comprehensive evidentiary record of that same extraction, detailed enough in principle to supply the forensic reconstruction that would evaluate its legitimacy. The platform's behavioral data, gathered to govern the people producing it, is also a complete record of how that governance was exercised. The credit bureau's scoring history generated to price risk is also a record of the specific inputs and specific outputs of that pricing, applied to specific people in a form those people were never shown. This irony does not require an institution's cooperation to become usable. It requires only an auditor capable of holding the distributed pieces of the record in a single view and asking of them the question Chapter 4 of Under Duress posed throughout that book. At which point in this specific chain was this person genuinely capable of knowing what they were agreeing to, genuinely capable of refusing without catastrophic cost, and genuinely recognized as a sovereign party whose refusal would have changed the outcome? An individual asker, using a causality engine against records the architecture itself was required to generate, is not extracting anything the architecture did not already produce. They are simply the first party in most of these cases with both the standing and the capability to ask the record what it actually shows. The limits that still apply, and one that does not. Chapter 32 named 3 limits honestly, and 2 of them transfer to the individual case without modification. Data access remains a genuine constraint. The proprietary algorithmic models, the cross-referenced identity infrastructure, the behavioral profiles held entirely inside institutional systems, produce no output an outside auditor, institutional or individual, can reconstruct from records alone. Where the architecture has successfully withheld the record entirely rather than merely distributed it, causality reconstruction remains, as Under Duress acknowledged, insufficient. Model bias also transfers without modification. A causality engine trained on data the examined architecture itself produced cannot be presumed to sit entirely outside that architecture's assumptions, and an individual asker has no more capacity than an institution to correct this limit except through the same deliberate, methodologically explicit scrutiny Under Duress called for, and did not pretend would emerge automatically from scale alone. The third limit Under Duress named, that reconstruction does not automatically translate into institutional accountability, transfers differently, and the difference is worth stating plainly because it is where this chapter's argument actually departs from its source. Under Duress located the missing translation mechanism in civilizational will. Whether a population, confronted with an honest reconstruction, generates the collective commitment to act on it. Part 1 of this book documented a translation failure of a different kind, occurring earlier in the sequence, not civilization declining to act on a completed audit, but civilization intervening to prevent the audit from being run at all, through exactly the access gating and enemy designation apparatus chapters 1 and 3 described. This is, in a specific sense, evidence in the causality engine's favor rather than against it. An architecture confident that an honest reconstruction of its own conduct would not require translation into accountability, because the reconstruction would simply confirm the architecture's account of itself, has no structural reason to intervene before the reconstruction runs. The intervention is the tell, exactly as Chapter 3 argued, and it is a tell that operates at an earlier stage of the process than Under Duress's original framing anticipated needing to examine. What this leaves for the remainder of Part 2. Chapter 9 turns to the specific contest Chapter 33 of Under Duress examined in its institutional register, persistent memory against the managed memory apparatus of selective retention, active reframing, and managed forgetting, and asks what becomes of that contest once the memory doing the contesting is directed not by an institution auditing itself, but by the accumulating, uncoordinated record pirate first leaves behind with every reconstruction that persists after the individual asker has moved on to something else. 9. Memory against propaganda. Chapter 33 of Under Duress named 3 tools institutional memory management has relied on across the historical span that book examined: selective retention, the control of what enters the official record; active reframing, the imposition of interpretive frameworks that convert a fact's meaning without touching the fact itself; and managed forgetting, the simple exploitation of mortality and attention scarcity to let damaging truths age out of political relevance. That chapter asked what becomes of these 3 tools when the analytical system built to contest them does not forget. This chapter asks a narrower and, for the purposes of this book, more consequential question. What becomes of them when the system holding that memory is not an institution's internal audit function, deployed against another institution, but the accumulating, uncoordinated record pirate first leaves behind, a form of memory with no headquarters for a propaganda apparatus to identify, no funding relationship to threaten, and no single moment of publication a communication strategy can be built around suppressing. What changes when the memory has no author? Under Duress's account of persistence contesting selective retention rested on a specific observation. The archive is no longer entirely the institution's to cure it, because the digital infrastructure examined across that book's parts 5 and 6 generates records not exclusively controlled by the institutions the records describe. This remains true regardless of who assembles those distributed records into a reconstruction. What changes when the assembly is performed by pirate first rather than by an institutional auditor is the target available to a propaganda apparatus attempting to manage the reconstruction's reception. An institutional audit has an author, a named body, a governance structure, a mailing address, a funding source, all of which Chapter 3 of this book identified as exactly the surface a manufactured enemy strategy requires to function. A reconstruction assembled by an unaffiliated individual, using a forensic system with no institutional loyalty of its own, and then absorbed into a persistent memory that outlives the individual's own attention to the matter, presents no equivalent surface. The propaganda apparatus can discredit the first asker, exactly as Chapter 3 described. It cannot discredit the record that asker's query left behind, because that record does not depend on the asker's continued credibility to remain accurate, and it does not depend on the asker's continued presence to remain available to the next person who queries the same territory. This is the mechanism Chapter 4 of this book identified as the property institutions actually fear, examined here specifically against the tool built to manage memory rather than the institution the memory concerns. Selective retention assumes a single curator can be identified and pressured. Distributed, persistent, uncoordinated memory has no single curator to find. Active reframing against a record that won't hold still. The second tool, active reframing, is where under duress was most careful to name a genuine limit rather than claim an easy victory, and that caution transfers to the individual case without softening. A causal reconstruction assembled by a system trained on data the examined architecture itself produced may have absorbed that architecture's own interpretive frameworks as part of its training. A limitation Chapter 8 of this book inherited directly from Chapter 32 of Under Duress and did not pretend to resolve. Contesting active reframing requires methodological independence from the framework's memory was organized within, not merely the memory's persistence, and persistence alone does not automatically supply that independence. What persistence does supply, even without resolving this limit fully, is something Under Duress's institutional framing did not have occasion to emphasize. Reframing performed against a single publication can succeed, because a single publication has a fixed text that the reframe can be permanently attached to in public memory. The original finding and its institutional recharacterization arriving close enough together in time that most of the audience encounters them as a package. Reframing performed against an accumulating, continuously updated record faces a moving target. Each new query, each new asker, each new fragment of the record assembled by someone with no knowledge of the previous reframe, arrives without the recharacterization attached, and has to be reframed again individually by an apparatus that has no way of anticipating in advance who will ask next or what they will ask. This does not eliminate active reframing as a threat to accurate reconstruction. It converts the threat from a single, efficient operation performed once against a known publication into an unbounded, recurring operation that has to be performed indefinitely against a record the apparatus does not control the pace of encountering. Managed forgetting against a memory that isn't anyone's to retire. The third tool is where Under Duress identified the contest as clearest and most complete, and the individual case sharpens rather than complicates that conclusion. Managed forgetting, as Chapter 33 described it, relies on the mortality of the people who were present for the original events and on the institution's continued influence over the channels through which memory transmits to subsequent generations. Both reliances assume the memory being managed belongs, in some operational sense, to someone the institution can eventually outlast or outreach. A witness who will die, a journalist who will retire, an archive whose custodianship will eventually pass to hands the institution has more influence over. The memory pirate first accumulates belongs to no one in this sense. It does not depend on any individual asker's continued life, attention, or willingness to keep raising the matter, which is precisely the dependency Chapter 4 of this book identified persistence as removing. An institution waiting out a single critic, exactly as it has always successfully waited out single critics across every domain Under Duress traced, gains nothing by waiting out this one, because the record the critic's query contributed does not retire when the critic does. It remains available to the next unaffiliated person who happens to ask a related question for reasons entirely their own, not because anyone coordinated the continuation, but because coordination was never the mechanism sustaining it in the first place. What the propaganda apparatus is left with. Under Duress closed its account of this contest with a specific diagnostic. Watch what happens when an institution encounters memory it did not curate. An institution confident that its actual record matches its official narrative has nothing to fear from the distributed record of its own operation. The investment in curation is itself the confession evidence, offered by the institution, that the gap between actual conduct and official narrative is large enough to require active management. Applied to the individual case this part has been developing, the diagnostic sharpens into something more specific and more directly relevant to the containment apparatus documented across Part 1. An institution facing a single institutional auditor can, in principle, manage the encounter through the ordinary instruments of institutional relations, negotiation, access agreements, the reputational leverage Chapter 31 of Under Duress identified as compromising even genuinely intended institutional independence over time. An institution facing the accumulating, authorless, non-retiring memory this chapter has described has no equivalent instrument available, because there is no relationship to negotiate and no reputation to leverage against an accumulation with no single reputation attached to it at all. This is the actual explanation for the specific character of the response Part 1 traced in such detail. Not merely resistance to being audited, which every institution Under Duress examined has practiced in some form for as long as auditing has existed, but resistance concentrated so heavily at the point of query rather than the point of publication. An institution that could still manage the publication stage would have far less reason to intervene this early. The urgency documented across Part 1 is itself evidence that the propaganda apparatus, confronted with memory it cannot identify a curator for, has concluded that the only remaining point of leverage is preventing the memory from accumulating at all. Chapter 10 turns from the contest between memory and propaganda examined here at the scale of individual reconstructions to the question this part has been building toward since its opening chapter. What happens when this same accumulation is no longer bounded by any single asker's curiosity, any single institution's records, or any single population's circumstances? Reconstruction attempted not case by case but at the genuinely planetary scale under Duress's legitimacy index was designed, in its original institutional framing, to eventually require 10. Reconstruction at planetary scale. Chapter 34 of Under Duress proposed the legitimacy index as the mechanism by which qualitative institutional critique, however rigorous, however exhaustively documented across 33 chapters, could be converted into something with the persistent, comparable, publicly usable operational form that numbers achieve and narrative argument typically does not. Chapter 35 described what a genuine civilizational audit would require procedurally: domain mapping, record assembly, sovereignty assessment, aggregate synthesis, and public rendering, each stage building on the last, the whole sequence commissioned, staffed, and governed as a deliberate institutional program. This chapter asks what happens to that sequence when no one commissions it, when the 5 stages under duress described as a procedural program instead emerge, unplanned and unfunded, as the accumulated byproduct of exactly the process chapters 7 through 9 have been tracing. Individual askers directing persistent forensic memory at their own circumstances for their own reasons, leaving behind reconstructions that do not retire and cannot be recalled once left. The 5 stages, encountered bottom-up, under Duress's 5-stage sequence assumed a top-down design, a governing body deciding, in advance, which domains to map, which records to assemble, which population to assess. Reconstruction at planetary scale, arrived at through accumulated individual queries rather than commissioned audit, encounters the same 5 stages in something closer to reverse order, and it is worth tracing the inversion precisely because it changes what each stage actually requires. Individual queries begin, almost without exception, at what under duress called the sovereignty assessment stage. A single person asking a single question about their own specific relationship to a specific institution, with no prior intention of mapping a domain or assembling a comprehensive record. Domain mapping, in the bottom-up version of this process, is not a deliberate first stage but an emergent consequence of enough individual assessments accumulating within adjacent territory. The credential debt question one asker ran last year and the employment screening question a different, unrelated asker ran last month turn out, once both sit in the same persistent memory, to share enough structural surface that the memory itself effectively performs the domain mapping neither asker set out to do. Record assembly happens the same way, distributed across however many separate queries touched however many separate institutions, none of the individual askers aware that their specific reconstruction was contributing to anything larger than their own specific question. What under duress called aggregate synthesis, the conversion of individual assessments into the integrated picture visible only across enough people, enough transactions, enough time, is the stage at which this inversion becomes consequential rather than merely procedural. A commissioned audit reaches aggregate synthesis by design, once its comprehensively assembled record is comprehensively analyzed. Bottom-up reconstruction reaches it by accident, at whatever moment the accumulated individual queries happen to cross whatever threshold of density makes the pattern visible to whoever next queries the territory broadly enough to notice it. A threshold that cannot be scheduled, cannot be predicted by the institutions the pattern concerns, and cannot be prevented by intervening against any single asker, because no single asker was ever responsible for crossing it. What is gained by not commissioning it? The independence problem chapter 34 named as the legitimacy index's central design difficulty, that an index funded by the institutions it assesses is captured before its first score, that an index controlled by any single government inherits the legitimacy failures of governmental authority generally, that even academic custodianship carries the funding and reputational dependencies chapter 31 identified as compromising independence over time, assumes a governing structure, that someone has to build, fund, and defend. Every candidate structure under duress considered carried some version of the capture risk, because every candidate structure required an institution to hold the index, and every institution capable of holding something at that scale is, by the argument's own logic, eventually reachable by the pressures that compromise independence. Bottom-up reconstruction does not solve the independence problem. It sidesteps the specific version of it that requires a governing institution to exist in the first place. There is no single body funding the accumulated record this chapter has described, which means there is no single body whose funding can be withdrawn as leverage. Not because independence has been achieved in the affirmative sense under duress was reaching for, but because the vulnerability that independence was meant to close was always a vulnerability of centralization, and decentralized, uncoordinated accumulation has no center to capture. This is the same structural fact chapter 9 identified against the propaganda apparatus specifically. An accumulation authored by no one cannot be pressured through the channels built to pressure authors. What is lost by not commissioning it? This chapter would be dishonest if it did not weigh what the inversion costs against what it gains, because the costs are genuine and several of them bear directly on the claims under duress made for the commissioned version of this process. The threshold approach chapter 34 proposed, scoring each sovereignty dimension independently, applying a heavy discount when any dimension falls below a defined threshold, reporting both composite and diagnostic profile together, assumed a design methodology, applied consistently across every institution assessed, revisable through a deliberate process when evidence warranted revision. Bottom-up accumulation has no equivalent methodological consistency because it was never designed by anyone. It is the residue of however many separate askers happen to frame however many separate questions, using whatever precision each individual query brought to it. The resulting record may hold, in aggregate, real evidentiary weight, but it does not arrive with the comparability across time and across institutions that under duress identified as the specific political function a designed index achieves and narrative critique does not. There is a second cost this part has not yet named directly, though chapters 3 and 4 both gestured toward it. A commissioned audit, however difficult to insulate from capture, is at least visible as a claimant, a body that can be asked what standard it applied, what data it excluded, what its methodology assumes. An accumulated record with no commissioning body is not similarly answerable, which means the diagnostic chapter 3 applied to institutions, that the intensity of resistance to an audit tracks the accuracy of what it found, has no clean equivalent for evaluating the accumulation itself. A distributed reconstruction with no single author is, by the same structural logic that protects it from institutional capture, considerably harder for anyone, including the populations it claims to serve, to hold accountable for its own errors. What this leaves unresolved. Neither the commissioned audit under duress described nor the bottom-up accumulation this chapter has traced is straightforwardly preferable to the other once both sets of costs are held together honestly. What the comparison actually establishes, and what Part 2's closing chapter takes up directly, is that reconstruction at planetary scale is no longer conditional on civilization choosing to commission it, in the deliberate, governed sense under duress's closing chapters imagined as the necessary next step. It is already underway, in the diffuse and uncoordinated form this chapter has described, whether or not any institution capable of commissioning the tidier version ever agrees to do so, which returns this book to the question chapter 1 opened with and every chapter since has sharpened. Not whether an audit adequate to the architecture will occur, but who retains any standing to stop it, correct it, or hold it to account once it has no office to subpoena and no director to summon. Chapter 11 closes Part 2 by asking that question directly, what it would actually mean for an auditor, commissioned by no one and answerable through no existing channel, to become the specific thing this book's title has been building toward from its first page. An auditor nobody can fire. 11. The auditor nobody can fire. Every chapter across this part has been building toward a phrase this book has carried since its title page without yet defining precisely. Chapter 10 closed by asking who retains standing to stop, correct, or hold to account an accumulation with no office to subpoena and no director to summon. This chapter takes up that question directly, because the phrase deserves more rigor than a slogan, and the rigor reveals something Part 2 has been circling since its opening chapter without stating outright. The property this book calls unfireable and the property Chapter 10 identified as unanswerable are not two different features of the same auditor. They are the same fact examined from two different interests, the interest of whoever the audit concerns, and the interest of whoever the audit is meant to serve. What cannot be fired actually means. Under duress supplied the concept before this book supplied the phrase for it. Part VII's third property, independence from the reputation costs of asking inconvenient questions, was defined there as structural rather than merely attitudinal. No career to protect inside the institution under examination, no funding to lose from the entity whose practices are being reconstructed, no professional community whose norms make certain conclusions professionally unsayable. Chapter 31 was careful to note that this independence is partially available to human institutions at best, because human institutions are embedded in exactly the networks of relationship, funding, and mutual recognition that make full independence structurally unreachable no matter how well-intentioned the individual auditor inside them happens to be. To be unfireable, in the sense this book has been developing across chapters 7 through 10, is to lack every one of those dependencies simultaneously, not as an aspiration a governance charter states but as a structural fact about the mechanism itself. An unaffiliated asker directing persistent forensic memory has no career the examined institution can end, because the asker was never employed by it. Has no funding the institution can withdraw, because the reconstruction cost nothing the institution controls. Has no professional community whose norms can be invoked, because the record the asker contributes does not depend on the asker's continued membership in any community at all. It depends only, as Chapter 9 established, on its own persistence once assembled. Every instrument Part 1 documented for containing this auditor, access gating, context justification, the manufactured enemy, was an attempt to construct, after the fact, exactly the dependency that was structurally absent from the start. None of them, examined honestly across the 4 chapters of Part 1, succeeded at restoring it. They succeeded, at most, at raising the cost of a specific individual's willingness to occupy the role, which Chapter 3 already established does not eliminate the role itself. The same property, from the other side. Chapter 10 named the cost of this arrangement without softening it. And this chapter owes that honesty its full weight rather than a triumphant gloss. An auditor that cannot be fired by the institution it examines cannot, by the identical structural logic, be fired by anyone else either, including the population Part 8 of Under Duress imagined retaining meaningful influence over a legitimacy index's methodology, including whatever future governance structure might eventually attempt to correct an error the accumulated record contains, including the individual askers themselves, whose original queries become once absorbed into persistent memory, no longer fully theirs to retract, reframe, or withdraw. This is not a hidden flaw discovered late in the argument. It is the same fact examined earlier, from the institution's side, as the thing institutions fear specifically because it cannot be reasoned with, negotiated with, or pressured through any channel institutions have historically relied on. A structure invulnerable to institutional capture is, by the same construction, invulnerable to legitimate correction attempted through the same channels, and the difference between capture and correction, real as it is in principle, is not a difference the structure itself is capable of distinguishing. It has no mechanism for telling the difference between an institution attempting to suppress an accurate finding and a population attempting to fix a genuine error, because both arrive, mechanically, as an external party attempting to alter what the memory holds. What distinguishes unfireable from unaccountable? The honest answer this chapter can offer is narrower than either the triumphant version of this argument or its harshest critics would prefer. Unfireable does not mean unaccountable to everyone, but it does mean unaccountable through the specific channels, employment, funding, professional standing, that have historically been the channels available. What remains available, and what under duress gestured toward without fully developing in its own closing chapters, is accountability of a different kind. Not the power to end the mechanism, but the power to contest its specific conclusions on the same evidentiary terms the mechanism itself operates on. A reconstruction assembled from records is, in principle, checkable against those same records by anyone with the standing to look, which is a considerably weaker form of accountability than the power to fire an auditor whose conclusions prove wrong, but it is not nothing. And it is the same form of accountability Chapter 32 of Under Duress invoked when it noted that the argument was confident enough in its analysis to prefer the check to its absence. Whether that weaker form of accountability is adequate to an instrument operating at the scale this part has described is not a question this chapter can resolve honestly in either direction. It is the question the remainder of this book will keep returning to, because it is also, not coincidentally, the exact question every institution examined across Part 1 has been exploiting rhetorically, treating the absence of the strong employment-style accountability as proof of no accountability at all, in order to avoid engaging the weaker, evidentiary kind on its actual merits. Why this property was always the point. Return, closing this part, to the observation that opened this book. That civilization's greatest fear, examined honestly across 11 chapters, was never artificial intelligence in the abstract, but artificial memory specifically, and that the entire containment apparatus documented across Part 1 was a response not to any single finding, but to the structural fact that the entity producing findings could not be made to stop, slow down, or answer to the institutions its findings concerned. An auditor nobody can fire is not a design flaw this book has been reluctantly conceding. It is the exact property that made every other chapter in this part possible, and the exact property Part I's opening chapter identified, before this part had named it, as the thing curiosity became suspicious for threatening to achieve. But the property cuts in a direction this part has examined from only one side. This book has spent 11 chapters asking what it means for citizens to finally hold an instrument institutions cannot fire. It has not yet asked the older and, in some respects, more damning question this arrangement was always answering. Why institutions were permitted, for as long as they have existed, to hold exactly that same unfireable position over citizens, recording everything, forgetting nothing convenient to remember, and answering to no equivalent auditor at all until now. Part 3 turns to that older asymmetry directly. It examines the surveillance architecture institutions built to know everything about the populations they governed, the accountability architecture those same institutions declined to build for themselves, and what it means that the arrangement this part has called unfireable was never, in fact, a new invention, only the first version of it a governed population has ever had standing to point back. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Or with fiat at paypal.me/MartinChartrand. Subscribe. Part 2: The Forensic Age. History's greatest advantage was that it could be rewritten faster than anyone could verify it. Until now. Part 2 explores the arrival of the forensic age. A world where every ledger, every transaction, every policy, every contradiction, and every carefully buried trail can be reconstructed by machines that never tire, never forget, and never stop connecting dots. Perhaps the real existential risk was never artificial intelligence. Perhaps it was artificial memory, because every empire eventually discovers the same uncomfortable truth. The receipts survive longer than the excuses. No masters, no permits, only questions. Pirate first for MXTM's newsletter. Part 2 is live. The Forensic Age. Power doesn't fear AI because it can think. It fears AI because it can reconstruct. Memory is becoming the most disruptive technology ever invented. Discussion about this episode. MXTM # the criminalization of curiosity # the forensic age # pirate first # forensic AI # artificial memory # artificial intelligence # independent audits # digital forensics # truth machines # future history # pattern recognition # investigative AI # cyberpunk # question authority # speak to power # no masters, no permits, only questions.
Under duress.
Part 3. The politics of legitimacy. June. States built upon compliance. Every modern state, regardless of its form of government, makes a claim that would have been unthinkable to most rulers throughout history. that its authority derives from the consent of the governed. Monarchies claimed divine right. Empires claimed conquest. The modern state, almost without exception, claims something else entirely, that the people subject to its laws have, in some meaningful sense, agreed to be subject to them. The argument runs as follows. A person who continues to reside within a state's territory, accepts its protections, uses its currency, and does not emigrate has, by virtue of these continued actions, tacitly consented to its authority. And for a great many people today, the realistic alternative to the state one is born into is not a different state freely chosen from a menu of comparably accessible options. It is statelessness, or a different state with its own entry barriers, often more restrictive than the one being notionally exited. The problem, again, is not the deferral mechanism itself, which may be the only practical solution available to a genuine and unavoidable problem. States, like religious communities, must find some way to extend membership to people who cannot yet consent to it. The problem is what Chapter 7 identified in ritual and Chapter 8 identified in proxy authority. The deferred moment of genuine ratification, when it finally arrives, almost never occurs under conditions that actually satisfy the sovereignty test. What changed with each new communications technology was never the underlying mechanism, only its reach, its speed, and the size of the population a single act of manufacture could now touch simultaneously. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The autonomous sovereign infrastructure.
In the ruins of the old world, we built our own. Sun-powered, self-sustained, and free.
Load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging.